Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of this center. Welcome back to old friends who've been here many a time, many an event. And if this is your first time here, it's great to have you with us tonight for this book discussion in our series of faculty book events that we have every year. It's an exciting series based on a very simple premise that we have such wealth among us of scholars who do the most interesting work in diverse fields. Often the book comes out, we wave at the author, we congratulate them, and we never actually get to talk to the author about why he or she wrote the book and how it came about. And so the series is based on the simple premise that the benefit and advantage of having the author in our midst, and then two discussants or three discussants sometimes to look into the book and raise some of the issues, and then to share with the audience all your thoughts on the topic, which are often very important and timely topics, as tonight, that we're excited to be able to do this. So it's an informal setting. We'll have a certain simple structure to it. I'll introduce Dan McKanan, who is our author tonight, and then Dan will tell us a bit about how he came to write the book, how the book came about, and something about the process and what energized him in doing this project. Then I'll introduce our two respondents who will, or commentators who will say something about the book from their perspective. Dan will get a chance to speak about their comments, any points that he wants to follow up on, and then we will open it for general discussion. So you're all part of this conversation. If during the time we're meeting you feel you need refreshment, please walk to the back and get something else, but it's a very casual event that we have tonight. And at the end, I'll tell you about upcoming events. We already have 2 more book discussions planned for this year, and possibly 3 already planned for next year. So it's an ongoing series, and I'll tell you about those at the end. But tonight we have a discussion of Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition, published by Beacon Press. And our author is Dan McKanan, of course, of our own faculty. Dan came to Harvard Divinity School just a few years ago in July 2008 as the first Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity. Before coming to Harvard, Dan served as department chair and associate professor of theology at the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University, where he had begun teaching in 1998. His specialties are diverse, but he studies in particular religious movements for social transformation in the United States from the abolitionist era to the present. His first book in 2002, Identifying the Image of God, Radical Christians and Nonviolent Power in the Antebellum United States, explored theological understandings of violence and nonviolence among abolitionists, pacifists, and temperance activists. In 2007, he published Touching the World, Christian Communities Transforming Society, and in 2008, The Catholic Worker After Dorothy Day, Practicing the Works of Mercy in a New Generation. And these books respectively deal with the Campbell and Catholic Worker Networks of Intentional Communities. Dan's new book, which conveniently and subtly is on sale if you'd like to bring home your copy, autographed. We hear the author is willing to give autographs as well. Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition is a general, sweeping, and therefore bold history, to dare to undertake such a sweep, history of religion and the left in the United States. It's a new book and not many reviews out, but I did find one from the Kirkus Review, which says this about the book. The book explores the role of faith communities in movements ranging from abolitionism to environmentalism. McKanan documents the individuals and organizations across the history of American radicalism, identifying and explaining links that may not be obvious to the casual reader. Protestant Christianity necessarily plays the major role here, but McKanan goes to great lengths to discuss the radical aspects of Catholicism, Judaism, and even such belief systems as Wicca. So the book has been well noted already, and I can't resist reading one of the comments from the back cover, which one to choose. John Buren's, author of A House for Hope, secularist individualists, please take note. Encounters and dialogue between religiously motivated radicals and more secular activists remain important. America, the nation with the soul of a church, cannot be changed by those who ignore or scorn religion. This book proves that in vitalizing stories. So let us welcome Dan and hear him tell us about his book.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. As Frank said, my role is first to tell you a little bit about the story of how this book came into existence, and this is one case where the book really grew very directly out of teaching. So I'm going to tell you about that teaching context. This is back when I was in Minnesota. At St. John's and St. Ben's, I was teaching both undergraduates and graduate students of ministry. And at the graduate school of theology, I was mostly working with Roman Catholic lay people preparing for ministry in Catholic parishes as lay people. And I was teaching a Survey U.S. religious history course and was thinking, well, how can I structure this course so that it really suits the needs of people preparing for ministry. Dietmar was in this course on one occasion. I don't remember if you were here in it before or after I kind of did the reconstruction that I'm about to describe. But I decided I wanted to do the course thematically rather than chronologically. Very much from the perspective of Catholic lay ministry. And so I said, okay, I'm going to take 1/4 of the semester and we're going to look at the ways in which Puritanism and revivalism laid one foundation for American religious culture. And then a second part of the course where we would look at the ways in which the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and the tradition of disestablishment and religious freedom laid another kind of complementary foundation for American religious culture. And then a third of the course where we would look at how Roman Catholics made a home in a religious culture shaped by those two other forces. And finally, because both I and many of the students had strong interests in social justice, we would spend a quarter of the semester looking at religious engagement in the public sphere and attempts to change society on the basis of religious ideals. And I wanted to find one anchor text for each of these four themes. Now, the Puritan revivalism theme was tricky. In some senses, every book about American religious history, and therefore no book about American religious history, addresses that theme. For the religious pluralism and Catholic engagement with American religious culture, it was really easy to find excellent books that dared to cover that much territory. And I brought them for show and tell. And these are the two individuals who I can blame for giving me the courage to take on a topic as broad as the topic of prophetic encounters. So for religious pluralism, we have Harvard's own Bill Hutchison, Religious Pluralism in America. Had I wanted to do a more sociological rather than historical approach, certainly Diane L's work would also have served me very well in that slot. And then for Catholic engagement with American religious culture, John McGreevy, Catholicism and American Freedom. Another, and you can see this one's actually kind of thin. So he tried to do this very broad story in a thin scope. McGreevy is at about the same thickness as, a little thicker than Prophetic Encounters. His editor is probably a little more generous than mine. But there really was nothing at all suitable for the fourth part of the course, the part that was closest to my own heart. And part of the reason is that although there's an enormous amount of scholarship on religion and social change in the United States, most of it is chronologically specific. So a study about the abolitionist era. There are any number of really wonderful works on that. Any number of wonderful works on social gospel activism at the beginning of the 20th century. And any number of wonderful works on civil rights period. But almost nothing that attempted to put those different moments and styles of activism into dialogue with one another. So my initial goal was to kind of do a three-way dialogue among those traditions: abolition, social gospel, and civil rights activism. And those two models gave me hope that was possible. Then I came here, and that gave me a wider range of people to be in conversation with. Many of you in the room were in one or the other version of the class on the topic. And I started digging deeper, and gradually my three great peaks of religious social activism in the United States began to dissolve a little bit. And I became more and more interested in the continuities of the tradition and the ways in which people kept the abolitionist heritage alive in the somewhat more conservative period after the Civil War. The ways in which people kept a social gospel vision alive in the red baiting and McCarthy eras of the 1920s and the 1950s. And I came to see that my topic was much more a continuous radical tradition than a set of three separate historical moments. This is my third show and tell. Tim McCarthy's Radical Reader, the best the best and most recent instantiation in a long series of books by radical scholars trying to lift up the long tradition in which they stand. And interestingly enough, these kinds of books, I don't know if you were thinking about this when you did yours, Tim, but these kinds of books are most prevalent during conservative periods. During periods of conservative ascendancy, radicals really tend to their tradition and their history. And perhaps we're right now standing at a moment of transition in terms of who's in the ascendant in the U.S. We'll see. As I looked more deeply at the continuous tradition of American radicalism, the other thing that happened, and this is the point I'll conclude with, is that my original subject matter somewhat dissolved in my mind. I had originally thought that I was writing about a cohesive group of people and movements called the religious left. And I was originally persuaded by those who saw that as kind of a distinct tradition over against the secular left. And gradually I came to see religion, spirituality, whatever language you want to use, as a thread that's woven into the left as a whole in a way that doesn't make it easy to draw a sharp distinction between religious and secular activists. And many of the stories that I became most interested in were stories of people who move in and out of so-called religious or so-called secular identities. Someone like Dorothy Day, who begins as a kind of countercultural bohemian activist and converts to Roman Catholicism, or someone like Norman Thomas, who begins as a pacifist Protestant minister and becomes an adherent of what he calls the implicit religion of radicalism, the spiritual ideals that are underlying work for socialism rather than any kind of doctrinal Christianity. So the interwovenness of the story became a major theme for me, and something that puts me in a little bit of tension with those who want to kind of defend the religious left against the slights and misunderstandings of the secular left. And I imagine some of you in this room are champions of the religious left in that sense. I hope we can continue to have some dialogue about those paradigm differences. That's probably all I need to say, so I invite my colleagues to come up and continue the dialogue.
So our custom is again to have several discussants, you might say first readers of the book, to open the discussion for us. And we have two tonight. First is our own colleague of Harvard Divinity School, Diane Moore, who is a senior fellow of this center itself. Diane pursues research interest in public understanding of religion through education from a cultural studies lens. Her ongoing focus is on the intersections of religion, ecology, and human rights. She's also interested in the relationship among religion, the arts, and social change. She is currently the director of the Religious Literacy Project, a project that continues her own dedication to, and the Divinity School's dedication to, rethinking education and the dissemination of knowledge across religious boundaries. This new project, which is housed upstairs, will be a virtual resource and research center aiming to create and maintain resources designed primarily for public school teachers and their students. So kind of a resource that can be used even globally, I think, to enable people to teach better and to cross the boundaries. So it's quite an exciting project, and we're very happy to have it here at the center. Diane also serves on the editorial boards of journals such as Religion and Education and the British Journal of Religious Education. She's also chair of the American Academy of Religion's Task Force on Religion in the Schools. In 2007, she published a book titled Overcoming Religious Illiteracy, a cultural studies approach to the study of religion in secondary education. She also somehow finds time to teach at Phillips Andover Academy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and she's also an ordained minister of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So a very busy person. And our second respondent discussant tonight is from far off, somewhere over near Harvard Yard. He managed to get here tonight. Timothy Patrick McCarthy is a lecturer on history and literature. He's a lecturer in public policy, director of the Human Rights and Social Movements Project of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. He also teaches in the Committee on Degrees in Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. His research agenda focuses on the relationship between human rights and social movements in three main areas: race relationships and civil rights, LGBT politics, policy, and advocacy, and modern-day slavery and human trafficking. At the Carr Center, he runs a bi-weekly study group on human rights and social movements and co-chairs the regional working group on modern-day slavery and human trafficking. Three of his recent books, The Radical Reader, which I believe was held up already, a documentary history of the American radical tradition, that was in 2003. Then in 2006, Prophets of Protest, Considering the History of American Abolitionism, and in 2010, Protest Nation, The Radical Roots of Modern America. Since 2002, he has also served as academic director of the Boston Clementi Course in the Humanities. This is a multidisciplinary college course offered free of charge to low-income adults through the Codman Square Health Center in Dorchester. He is also a founding director of Harvard's Alternative Spring Break, timely topic, Harvard's Alternative Spring Break Church Rebuilding Project, and has spent the last decade taking students to the down south to rebuild black churches that have been burned in arson attacks. He finds time also to lecture widely on topics in history, literature, politics, and human rights. So we have two very interesting respondents tonight, and I look forward to hearing their comments, which will open, I think, a wonderful discussion. And I believe that Diane goes first.
Good evening. It's just such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Dan, for writing such a remarkable and important book. I'm going to respond briefly with three different hats on, if you will. The first hat will be a personal hat. The second will be my hat as an ethicist, and the third will be my hat as an educator concerned with the public understanding of religion. Personally, I just have to say it was such a pleasure to read this text, because this is a tradition that I find myself also owning and a part of, and was deeply influential to my own understanding of religion and social change. And it was just so wonderful to see that long history told in such rich and vivid fashion. And I also really appreciate it because I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan during the 1960s and 70s in a very radical church there in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, thinking very naively, as it turns out, that all churches were like this. So we were deeply embedded with this understanding that faith was always about social action and justice. And so notions of both economic justice, racial justice, anti-nuclear proliferation as in little later years, and certainly anti-racism was very deeply part of my own story, religious story, and feel so grateful to have grown up in that context. It shaped me beyond anything I can understand, even as I attempt to articulate that, and have recently been involved in this wonderful project with my mentor, who was the pastor of that church for 40 years. We're Skyping weekly. He's 89 years old now, and he's talking to me about his own oral history of those 40 years that he was pastor at that church. It turns out that church, and again, unbeknownst to me at the time, was the most radical church in the United States. The Christian church is a Congregationalist Protestant church, and so it has theological diversity, tremendous theological diversity. It's something that I actually cherish about that tradition, and allows for everyone from the very far right, what we associate with the very far right, to be part of this body, as well as people or congregations in the one I grew up in. So it was a really, so your book was so rich in that way also to help me even further understand those diversities. I'm going to use that as a segue now to talk also then about some dimensions of both the text that I encountered myself personally, and also a little bit of my own research as an ethicist. So this church, which was such a rich, radical place for all these intersecting understandings, class, race, the environment, anti-war, did not do so well with gender and sexuality. And so I'm a lesbian, and actually didn't come out as a lesbian until after I left that congregation, but found myself thinking I was going to go into a whole lot of other professions, but to the extent that a call to religion or ministry means that you keep trying to do other things and can't seem to do those other things, keep getting called back, I was troubled because I felt like, well, maybe ministry, but was an out lesbian. Came here actually to do my MDiv, and it was here that I just decided to try at least or think about pursuing ministry, and went back to that congregation. In my tradition, the congregation ordains you. And my mentor and my beloved mentor was really troubled by my sexuality and challenged by it in a way that was not surprising to me, but certainly difficult. I did get ordained in that church, and it ended up being very fun and very lucky for me compared to many of my colleagues at the time. This is in the 1980s, so it was still pretty unusual to be able to ordain someone, and it was that church's long radical history that allowed them to move in that direction. So the segue, though, is that that ended up giving me a framework for my own doctoral work in ethics. So I ended up focusing my dissertation on looking at the liberal Protestant tradition and looking at this question of gender, sexuality, and sex, and seeing its consistencies and inconsistencies, particularly through issues of reproduction initially, reproductive rights, abortion, and then moving on into then questions of sexuality. And so, Dan, this is one of my questions for you. In my own study and personal experience, but study too, I found that that was a real weak point in Protestant theology. Issues of sexuality and gender were unsustainable in my experience, not just personal experience, but in my research too, because there would be moments and pockets, but that it just challenged, the core was so challenging for Protestant theological voices, and the lack of consistent frameworks for Protestant theological expression, I think, around gender, because it was such a difficult and challenging topic. Really, so we certainly have pockets, and you identify beautifully many of them, but I'm interested in your comment about the failure to sustain, I think, in a deep way, and that in fact in the 1970s and 80s then, the attacks around sexuality, around women's rights, and around abortion became a real catalyst for organizing conservative forces, and the churches, the liberal Protestant churches, really were not able to sustain a successful challenge to those really stark attacks that continue to this day. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that. And then finally, I'm so incredibly grateful for your text from my lens as an educator, because for those of us in religious studies, it's very commonplace to recognize these three frameworks of how we understand religion, or accurate frameworks for how religion should be understood, I should say. And one of them is that religions are internally diverse. The second is that they evolve and they change. These are they're self-evident to those of us on this side of the world. So religions are internally diverse, they evolve and they change, and that religion is embedded in all dimensions of human agency and expression. There's no, we talk as though religion lives in this isolated place of faith and ritual. Yet it's never been the case, and it's clearly not the case. And when asked, people will recognize it's not the case. But we still both teach about religion, unfortunately, and we talk about religion as though we have this incredibly clear divide between secular and religious. And that's just not the case, never been the case. And your book is such a wonderful resource representing all of those facets. And I'm extremely excited about it, because it'll be a wonderful set of case studies for educators to say, what does it mean to really look at the diversity within traditions, evolution within traditions, and change, and also the embeddedness of religion in all dimensions, and to challenge the simplistic secular religious divide. And currently, we still are teaching people about religion by teaching them as though we can learn anything about the Four Noble Truths, the 10 Commandments, the 5 Pillars, in these isolated ritual ways. This is how we introduce students to religion. And it's, the work that I'm doing and that we're doing through the Religious Literacy Project is to really complicate that and challenge that, and to look at real lived experience as case studies for the nature of how we represent those three intersections. So your book is a really wonderful resource in that. I'm just so thrilled that you wrote it, and I understand that you have taken on a really controversial challenge by being so widespread and sweeping, but I think that you lay out and represent your claims in a really intellectually rigorous and fair-minded way. And so not only what you're doing here in terms of the content, but the nature of how you lay out this argument in your frameworks, I think is just going to be tremendously helpful for educators and for a better public understanding of religion. So thank you so much for that. And it was just a real pleasure and privilege to read it and to be here. So thank you.
I must say, coming all the way over here from the Kennedy School is a great pleasure for a couple of reasons that it just occurred to me, aside from the lovely setting over here. I keep using the word lovely to describe the Divinity School, and also Dan, who is like one of the loveliest people I know. I so rarely use the word lovely to describe any of my colleagues. And yet, there you are. But the one thing I realized in Frank's introduction, and Diane's comments, and in Dan's comments, is how much louder we are at the Kennedy School than you all are at the Divinity School. I can be heard in the middle of Harvard Square, and everyone here seems so thoughtful and soft-spoken, and so I'm a little bit of a bull in a china shop, so I apologize for that. The other thing that for me is so obvious is what a special place the Divinity School is, because it has got to be the only place in Harvard where a straight man would invite a lesbian and a gay man to critique him. Or maybe even in America, I don't know, or anywhere, I don't know. This is truly fabulous, truly fabulous. If only the world operated that way, we might be getting somewhere. Anyway, I jest, sort of. Let me just start by saying that I am, one of the things that I love about Dan is, and appreciate about you, is that we toil in the same vineyard, intellectually, politically, and when you first reached out to me, when you were really starting to think about writing this book and sort of beginning to write it, we had a lovely lunch at Daedalus on the roof deck, and I realized, and you had said then that you had been, partly inspired by my own book on the radical tradition, documenting the history of American radicalism. And I, of course, had read your work and had been inspired by yours because I was at the time working on a book on abolitionism. And so I've always appreciated the fact that there is this other person here who is such a kindred spirit and such a kindred soul in terms of the academic work that we do and also the political work that we do, both here and far outside of it. And so I've always appreciated that. And I also very personally appreciate the fact that much of the way that Dan talks about his work is a kind of organic origin, that his work comes from teaching, and it comes from activism, and it comes from the kinds of relationships that he has. And I think that is where the best work comes from, is those kinds of organic places. And you talk about that, and I know that you take that seriously because we shared a student, one of my students, who probably most brilliant student that I've had here, won the Hoops Prize for a terrific social studies thesis on the Catholic worker movement. And he had found his way to Dan, and Dan had been immensely, immensely helpful in that thesis, and I saw that your sort of mark on that thesis, much more so even than mine, and he loved you, and I loved him, and so therefore we all love each other. But that's a real thing, and one of the things that I think it speaks to is that this first book that I did, this radicalism documentary, came out of teaching too. I was a first-year TA, or as a third-year graduate student TAing for Eric Foner at Columbia University, the very famous historian who I studied with there, and he taught a course in the American radical tradition. And it was a course where he would teach, kind of an old-fashioned way of teaching, where he would teach a kind of monograph a week. So these were secondary works of history that he would teach, and one of the things I realized in teaching that course is that the students were hungry for the primary documents. They wanted to go back to the actual texts from Frederick Douglass and Dorothy Day and the founding fathers and all these different people in the past that they were reading about in these books through the lens of the interpretation of scholars and historians. But they really wanted to go back to the original source, which is, of course, what historians do. And so I decided that I was going to do this for them. So I would go into the library and track down all of this. When I was really ambitious as a graduate student, I would go to find like primary document collections, often collections from Philip Foner and Herbert Aptheker and Carter G. Woodson, all of these old Marxist and African-American radical scholars who have put together these great anthologies in the 30s and 40s that you are, of course, very familiar with. And I would just Xerox these primary documents from all these different anthologies and collections, and I would just give them to my students, totally illegal, violating every possible copyright law. It was an act of civil disobedience in and of itself. And by the end of the term, I had this sort of big stack of primary documents that I had used with my students to kind of analyze these primary things. And Foner said to me, you should make a book out of that. And then literally the week after that, he was approached by the New Press to do a documentary history of American radicalism. And he said, no, I have a graduate student that is going to do this. And he came to me and said, I think I can get you a book contract. And it was interesting that you would make that point about the sort of connection between politics and history, because it was at the moment that I started to teach that course in American radicalism, which I now teach versions of in my own right, on my own terms, different kinds of courses, was really at a moment when I was feeling profoundly alienated in the 90s, living in Harlem, in Giuliani's New York, when Bill Clinton had frustrated so many of us who had been inspired by his message of hope and change in 1992, which was my first presidential election that I voted in. And then we worked on the book in that context, in the context of feeling profoundly disappointed with the political possibilities and the political realities of our world. And then, of course, the book came out a year and a half after 9/11. And so you're right to speak to that, this kind of way that so many of us find our way back to these histories in these times of political despair. And that I think, is something that is not always, shall we say, validated by the academy and its sort of ways of evaluating the work of young scholars in particular. And so as someone who has bucked up against that at times, I want to sort of begin by saying that I really acknowledge and appreciate your courage in taking on a book like this, because it's a book that is explicit about its own soul and its own politics. And you, as a chronicler of this history, which is ambitious to be sure, but also quite profound, are part of that history. And I feel very much part of this history, as do you, Diane. And so, and I think that that's one of the things that gives to this work of radicalism a kind of moral dimension. that I think is really important if it's going to have broad resonance, not only in the academy, but far outside of it, and with our students who are only here for a time and then go out into the world to do their thing. And so I think this work is profound in that way and will be very far-reaching. Let me offer a couple of comments, and I'm going to be a little selfish here because as we toil in these vineyards, I'm going to ask some questions of you that are often asked of me that I don't always have the response for. And so I want to actually just engage in a conversation with you as a kindred kind of intellectual and political spirit, as well as Diane, who I just met, who I love. God, you're lovely too. And just kind of have a conversation so that we can begin to think about how we respond to the potential criticisms and limitations of doing this work. And so the first thing I wanted to say is that is this question of tradition, right? When I characterized this American radical tradition, that was in some ways an intentionally political framing. When we think of tradition, we think about it within the context of a kind of conservative valence. Right? Traditions are things that are hidebound and they preserve things and they move on across time and they're timeless in some ways. And one of the things that I wanted to do is kind of reclaim that word. To reclaim that word as a way to characterize a kind of lifeblood of American democracy that began even before the nation was founded and that is very much alive and well today and has always been. And to see that as something that runs through the political institutions and frameworks and cultural formations of this country and the social relationships, all of which you do such a great job of telling in this book and narrating. And it was a sort of political choice to think about how we might talk about radicalism, particularly a progressive or left radicalism, as something that is itself a tradition, one that is often in conflict with other traditions, one that often disrupts or refashions particular traditions, like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and some of the founding documents that you talk about here. But I get challenged on that a lot, and you do too, I know. And so I want to sort of pass on that challenge in a couple of ways. One, can you talk about something that is so variegated? Can we talk about something that is so variegated, so diverse, and so full of tensions itself as one singular tradition? Is it possible to use that word to accurately represent something that is itself so diverse and complicated? And I think I have an answer to that, but I'd like to pose that to see what you want to do with that. The second thing that I want to sort of think about in terms of tradition, I get all the time, is what about conservative radicals? Are conservatives, or right-wing folks, or people who are not left, can they be included in this radical tradition too? You know, Eric Foner was a Marxist, and he was a red diaper baby, and he was a radical, and everybody knew that. He was a lefty. That's why I went to Columbia to study with him. I am too. I wasn't a red diaper baby because those were gone by the time I was born. But, you know, I have that spirit in me. And I have taught conservative radicalism, but it's not something that intellectually or politically I spend most of my time writing about. I spend more of my time trying to contend with it. Than write about it. But what do we do with that tradition of radicalism? Is it part of the tradition that we're talking about? Is it itself its own tradition that is in conflict with the tradition of radicalism that we're talking about? So I just sort of offer that piece up. The second thing I want to sort of say is that, you know, in my own blurb here, and you and I have talked about this, you know, there's a way of thinking about this. One of the things you do in this book that I think is really quite important is to bring these traditions of faith and religion together with these traditions of radicalism. One of the things that I remember Foner saying to me when I was in graduate school, there was a moment where people were really, really worried about me in graduate school because I started, after my coursework was over, to read the King James Bible. And Columbia is a very secular place in lots of ways, and it's for the history department is full of Marxists. And I remember sitting in the courtyard reading the King James Bible, and people were looking at me like, "Why are you reading the King James Bible?" It was because I was about to embark upon a dissertation on the abolitionist movement. And everything I was reading in the primary documents was dripping with all these references to Judeo-Christian traditions and allusions and stories and parables and so forth, often without reference because they didn't have good footnoting mechanisms in the pamphlets of abolition. And I remember thinking, I can't understand these texts unless I understand this history. And I was raised Catholic, but I'm a recovering Catholic because I, too, had issues with my sexuality in the church. And I remember thinking, oh, my God, this is such a weird thing to be doing. And Foner said to me at one point in graduate school, he said, the one thing I like about you is you really are interested in radicalism, but you're one of the only people who actually takes religion seriously. And this book takes both of these things immensely seriously and puts them together in a way that is authentic to the actual historical record, right? That as you make a very strong case for in this book, that these things are intertwined in ways that are really, really important. But I'm wondering if, and you do a good job of showing when the relationship is working and when the relationship is a rivalry or it's a tense one. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of talk to, and I know you go into this in the book, but for those of us who haven't, those folks who haven't read the book, I think I'd like you to talk a little bit about what happens when that rivalry becomes a kind of irreconcilable difference. What happens, and this speaks to the, I think, the LGBT movement right now, that oftentimes those, and I'm doing a lot of work with the LGBT movement now, and there's a profound hostility to faith and religion, particularly religious institutions, because the right, the conservative kind of radical tradition, has kind of owned this debate and discourse in our modern period of politics. And so I'm wondering, what advice you would have, right, for a movement like the modern queer movement or LGBT movement. What do you do when this kind of religious tradition that you're talking about and this political radicalism that you're talking about actually, where it's hard to find a way for them to either have a relationship of rivalry or a relationship where those two threads of forces are intertwined? So I sort of want to sort of raise that as well. And then I want to, and it's related to that is this idea of strategy and movements, right? If there's and the abolitionists had to deal with this, right? Religious texts, religious interpretation were contested for the abolitionists, right? There were pro-slavery folks who used the Bible to justify slavery. There were abolitionists who used the Bible to justify an abolitionist sensibility. And civil rights movement the same way. All of the sort of ways that people have been oppressed through interpretations of religious discourse, and all of the ways that radicals have sought to liberate themselves out of their systems of oppression by referring to those same texts, that these texts become themselves contested. You do a great job of showing that. But I'm wondering what happens when you can't appropriate or reinterpret or refashion a religious text or tradition for the purposes of liberation, when that becomes impossible, if that's the case. So I want to raise that. And then lastly, and then I'll just sit down, is this idea of the prophetic tradition. That one of the ways I think you define the prophetic tradition fairly broadly here for understandable purposes. And certainly in my work on radicalism and the abolitionist movement, and also the course I teach on American protest literature, this idea of prophecy, of the prophet, of the prophetic, is central to literary representation and also historical understanding and political work. And I'm wondering how do you talk about the prophetic tradition, which implies and raises all sorts of ideas about religion, about a kind of relationship with God, about an imagination of another world, whether it's here on earth, right? As the abolitionists believe that they were driven by a sort of by God to remake heaven on earth, right? And the abolition of slavery was how they would achieve that. But it often comes out of a kind of religious frame. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the prophetic tradition with people who are self-identified as secular political people? Is there such a thing as a secular prophetic tradition that is distinct from a kind of religious prophecy? And if there is, does that mark a kind of declension, right? The secular prophet is merely a kind of derivative, a sort of cheap derivative of someone who is moved by God to act in the world? Or is it a separate kind of prophetic valence that is in tension with the religious prophecies? So I'm wondering how you would say to that. So those are sort of my questions. But let me just say that, just in general, this is an immensely ambitious book, and I thank you for that. I think we need more ambitious work. I think junior people and like folks who are not, super old, sometimes when you have tenure and you're 60, you have the kind of wherewithal and the care. I'm going to do the most ambitious thing in the world. And I think it's really important for younger people, to be ambitious too. And you've proven that not only that you have the instinct to be, but you have the capacity to be. And this is a book that I think we need right now, profoundly. And I think it's a book that can really change the world, because when you tell stories about people who have done that, other people are inspired to do it too. Good job.
Thank you so much to both of you. So I'm going to take a few minutes to respond, and then we'll open it up to the broader conversation. I'm going to start with Tim's last point, because that will lead me into my response to Diane. And I'll respond to this question about what is the prophetic tradition for secularists by saying a little bit more about the somewhat weird way I use the category of the prophetic in this book. The prophetic encounters that I talk about are primarily person-to-person encounters among human beings. And so my point is that within the radical tradition, again and again, you have people encountering one another in a manner that has the force of revelation. For some, that fits hand in glove with more conventional notions of revelation. For others, it's the real revelation, and other kinds are a simulacrum. But either way, the common ground of the left is this experience of person-to-person transformation, the generation of new meaning and vision for transformation coming from that. And so that's something that the secularist and the religious person share, the experience of being set on a new path by the way you meet another person. And I talk about a couple of different kinds of prophetic encounters. Most basically is the kind of encounter what I call identity encounters, where people who've experienced a particular form of oppression get together, tell their stories, realize that they have commonalities, and find some sense of power in that. Another name for this would be consciousness raising. But one of the things I was really excited to learn is how continuous consciousness raising has been for the 200 years before anybody thought to coin that term. So you had laborers facing the rise of factories in the 1820s, doing consciousness raising as working men and gaining that sense of identity. You had African Americans doing consciousness raising around their being forced into the balconies of the churches they were part of in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and gaining a new sense of identity from sharing that experience. And what I call personal encounters are derivative from those identity encounters. That's when the newly empowered person meets someone with privilege and forces them to recognize their face. So Diane asked about the challenges that Protestants, and certainly Catholics as well, have had around issues of sexuality, even in contexts when they might have been on the left with regard to economic or racial issues. And oftentimes those challenges have to do with the interpretation of Scripture, that communities feel bound by their binding Scripture not to go in certain directions. And so the prophetic encounters that I talk about in this book are the crucial antidote to that, giving people a sense of alternative authority that can relativize what might seem to be the absolute claims of Scripture. And it's interesting, in the case of the GLBT movement, that religious contexts were crucially important for the emergence of activists on those issues. I was meaning to check, but I couldn't as I was listening to both of you speak. But I think it may be the case that both Dignity, the Catholic gay and lesbian organization, and the Metropolitan Community Churches were founded just before Stonewall. So already within religious communities, you had people getting together and doing that work of finding their common strength. And those kinds of organizations led the way for kind of the second wave of mainline religious engagement on issues of sexuality in the 80s as I was becoming conscientiousized. And that's the so-called reconciling movement. So groups like Dignity, Metropolitan Community Churches, Integrity for Episcopalians were specifically GLBT organizations for members of that community to support one another. In the 80s, they began challenging local congregations to express their solidarity. So you see the move from the identity encounter to that personal encounter. And I remember at the time I was a member at University Lutheran here in Harvard Square, and that congregation was going through the process of declaring itself a reconciled in Christ congregation. And the way we did it was by getting gay and lesbian folks to come and give their testimony to us. And I hadn't thought about this for a long time before today, but that really was the initial seed for this idea of prophetic encounters in this book, was remembering the enormous effect that those testimonies had on me personally. Because I had been kind of a sort of biblical authority person up to that point. Well, I really want to be compassionate, but I've got this text. So what do I do? And those testimonies broke through that for me. And all of the stories in this book are versions of that. Since I was long-winded on that point, I'm going to make one other point and then open it up. And my other point has to do with tradition. You're absolutely right that the word tradition has a conservative valence, and it also has a religious valence. And I don't usually try to make grand, sweeping claims about religion, but I'm going to invoke the possibility that ancestor worship, is a pretty foundational aspect of religion. And one of the reasons I think that churches have been, and other religious communities have been important seedbeds for radicalism is that they increasingly are among the only places where people tell ancestor stories. You go into the mall, you're not going to hear much of any stories more than 2 weeks ago, right? The marketplace is oriented to fashion. Religious communities are oriented to tradition, and part of tradition is telling those ancestor stories. And so to the extent that radicalism doesn't tell ancestor stories, it gets trapped into the logic of the market, which is not necessarily a logic that will fully serve it. That's an idea that's not really in the book. This is the new one of the new things that's coming up, but it pushes into. Actually, I do want to say a little bit more about the other question about what happens when religious and secular currents within the left are at loggerheads. One of the things I try to do in the book about that is to say there's more than two kind of camps here. So at one point I think I talk about 5 different camps. There are the people who see an easy mesh between their radical commitments and traditional religious claims, somebody like Dorothy Day. Then there are people who see a mesh between their radical commitments and their religious ideals, but think the actually existing churches are completely apostate to their own ideals. Someone like William Lloyd Garrison, who is as deeply Christian as anybody, but he goes after 95% of the Christians in his social context as having betrayed their own ideals. Then there are the people who believe that religion itself is the source of the problem, perhaps in many cases on the grounds that any kind of tradition in organization is going to preserve the status quo. And there's reason to think that's true. You know, church-going people are more conservative than non-church-going people in this society. And then there are folks who, on pragmatic grounds, wish they would all stop fighting. So someone like Susan B. Anthony is my classic example of this. She agreed with everything that Elizabeth Cady Stanton had to say, bashing the churches, but she sure wished Stanton would stop saying it so that it would be easier to get more pious folks like Frances Willard seamlessly on board the women's rights cause. And one of the things that happens when these different perspectives are unable to reconcile themselves is that people start over. So in the late 60s and early 1970s, a lot of particularly lesbian women who'd been completely alienated from, say, the church context, the Protestant campus ministries that had been so formative for them, as they became alienated from that, they realized they had to find their spirituality in other places. And so you have the goddess movement growing up, particularly at women's spaces, at communal lesbian communes and at lesbian festivals. It's fascinating to read this literature because of the way the lines get drawn. Somebody like Rosemary Radford Ruther, who in her own Christian context is seen as quite radical, is not nearly radical enough for women in this. But spirituality is important because spirituality is power, and they're rethinking the basis of power in a cooperative rather than combative way, and they know they can't do that without thinking about spirit. So, my own pragmatic strategy is to name these different approaches in hopes that after the moment of conflict might have died down, people can say, oh, there was some value in the approach that other person took. But that may be my usual lovely Pollyannishness.